Okay, so we are doing Learning Unit 5, and unfortunately I had thought that we'd covered LU4, and I wish we had actually. But okay, Learning Unit 5 is about water and sustainable development. And what I did was I quickly, before we go through the unit and some of the content and some summaries from some articles, I thought it would be very clever to just quickly go through the Learning Unit 5 assignment, which asks us to critically analyze the challenges countries in the global south face in addressing climate change impact on water resources. And then the readings, as you can see here, were all mentioned in Learning Unit 5 in some of the activities. So now we move to something I also thought was quite relevant before we start the learning unit, which was how the Sustainable Development Goals actually link to Learning Unit 5 and which of them link, because most of these people that are writing these articles, they refer to the SDGs. So let's quickly go through the SDGs. Maybe you'll use it as well in your assignment if you choose. So SDG 6 talks about clean water and sanitation. Learning Unit 5 focuses on water demand, water scarcity, water governance, access inequalities, and SDG 6 as a global goal for universal clean water and sanitation. Then SDG 1, no poverty. Water scarcity worsens poverty. Unequal access to water reinforces historical inequalities and affects livelihoods. Then there's the SDG 2, which touches on zero hunger, tells us that water is essential for agriculture. Climate change impacts water, which then impacts food production and food security. And then we've got SDG 3, good health and well-being. Contaminated or inadequate water leads to disease. Many water scarce communities suffer health crisis. And then gender equality. Water scarcity disproportionately impacts women who bear the burden of water collection and household water use, and also children. Children's times get taken away because they have to go collect water before school sometimes or after school. SDG 11, sustainable cities and communities. Urbanization and unequal distribution of water creates social vulnerability and water insecurity in cities. And then SDG 12, responsible consumption and production. Management of water resources, efficient water use, preventing pollution, and reducing demand are central themes in the unit. SDG 13, climate action. Climate change directly impacts water security, rainfall variability, and hydrological systems. SDG 14 tells us about life below the water, and then it tells us that freshwater ecosystems are degraded by pollution, overuse, and poor management, affecting aquatic biodiversity. SDG life on land. Healthy ecosystems depend on water availability. Water scarcity harms the soil, forests, biodiversity, and agriculture. And then talks about SDG 16 talks about peace, justice, and strong institutions. Water conflicts arise from unequal access, governance failures, create instability, and this is highlighted in essay and global examples. So for me, these SDGs actually provide a great concept map in terms of what these articles address. All of these articles, in some form or the other, mention all the SDGs and how they are impacted by the water challenges. So the last one was partnership and goals. This has to do with like your transboundary, where different countries are sharing water. So why it's relevant for the unit is because transboundary water management and cooperation between nations and communities is critical for water sustainability. So this unit strongly connects with SDGs concerned with water access, climate change, agriculture, governance, inequality, and resource sustainability. And then, okay, so after working through this unit, we should know the nature and extent of global demand for water. We should understand or evaluate the different narratives in water scarcity, analyze water policies and how they inform water management, demonstrate an understanding of the linkages between ecological integrity, water security, and water for agriculture, discuss debates on water, climate change impacts, and SD. So the intro tells us that the United Nations described water as a precondition for human existence and for the sustainability of the planet. The realization of access to clean water and sanitation for all is an important global goal, making this one of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. Water as a non-renewable resource that is key to the well-being and health of humans and ecosystems remains threatened by numerous challenges, including population increase, urbanization, climate change, inefficient agricultural practices, to name a few. Okay, so I just want to see if someone's trying to log in. No, sorry. I'm just admitting somebody. Okay, where was I? Okay, so now we're going to quickly go to section 5.2, which discusses nature and extent of water demand. When billions of people still lack access to clean water and or sanitation, this as a development goal remains a tall order, recognizing the demand for water in many sectors. The UN have put together a list of facts and figures that expresses the demand and extent of global water usage. Basically, I think this is a nice little box if you need to maybe introduce your topic. If it's water related, I think this is a great start to state the facts and the figures, of which I'm not going to be going through them because there's so much work, but you're going to get them in your book. So this is a great entry point if you're going to be touching on this topic, because it tells us how many people, the figures as they are, verbatim. And now we'll move on to the next section. So water cuts through many sectors, and the differential access to the resource is often a cause for conflict in areas where the resource is scarce. Also, due to its fluid nature, water does not stay in one place and becomes a shared resource and a responsibility of all those interconnected in its access and use. The farmer who is upstream, for instance, has to consider other users downstream, a situation that requires that policies be in place to manage access and use for the good of all. Debates and at times conflicts over access to water are often heightened in countries where there are historical inequalities between citizens, resulting in skewed access patterns of a resource commonly understood as a common good. In South Africa, for example, water resources are disproportionately distributed among citizens following discriminatory land practices and discriminatory legislation, such as the Water Act of 1956 that consolidated increased access to water by white communities through riparian water access provisions, while the new Water Act, the National Water Act of 1996, sought to address these flaws. Debates remain as to whether water is now equitably distributed in the country. A similar situation also exists in Canada, where even though it is a developed country, its history of colonization presents a case where First Nations people, communities indigenous to the Canadian land, struggle to access clean drinking water. These discriminatory practices hamper progress that could possibly be made towards achieving not only SDG 6, but also SDG 1 on ending poverty in all its forms. To the person who joined late, I just want to quickly tell you, if you need to watch the beginning of the video, the first 5 minutes, because it's very crucial. It shares all the SDG goals and how they tie into this learning unit. So maybe after class, you might just want to play the first 5 minutes. Okay. And then moving on to self-assessment activity 5.1, it tells us to read the e-reserve articles by White and Marcatelli and Bushker to learn more about the types and levels of conflicts over water and their impact on the different communities. And then it tells us to list 4 suggestions on how water should be managed for the benefit of all and save them for future discussion. So I'm literally going to do that right at the end. But what I want to do is I just want to share this article, what this article is about, a generative summary. So basically, it tells us that Canada has one of the world's renewable fresh waters, yet a large portion of indigenous communities, especially the First Nations, still lack safe drinking water, which with many communities experiencing long-term boil advisories. This contradiction is a paradox, the article interrogates. And despite over 2.5 billion invested in water infrastructure since 1996, over half of the reserve water systems remained medium or high risk, and over 119 First Nations were on water advisories as of 2012. The authors argue that the crisis is not a technological problem because Canada has the technical capacity to deliver clean water anywhere, but rather a product of colonial history, systemic capacity gaps, poor governance structures, and fragmented regulation. Those are very important for this article. And then the key points from the article is colonial history as the root of contemporary water inequality. The article emphasizes that unsafe water in Indigenous communities has deep historical roots, including forced relocation to marginal lands, dependence created by the Indian Act, destruction of traditional governance, and intergenerational impacts of residential schools. These processes undermined human, physical, and social capital, leaving communities without the capacity to maintain complex water systems. Tells us that there's a fragmented governance and unclear responsibilities. Responsibility for water on reserve is split between the AANDC, Health Canada, and Environment Canada, but responsibilities are poorly defined and accountability is weak. So here it tells us that they do fund infrastructure, but they cover 80% of the operating costs. The AANDC covers 80%, but the communities now must cover the remaining 20, and they can't. And then it tells us that the First Nations, which is your colonized or your ex-colonized group of citizens in Canada, are responsible for operation, monitoring, and maintenance, often without adequate training or funding. This regulatory vacuum is one of the most significant structural barriers. Funding gaps and dysfunctional funding mechanisms. So the article highlights chronic problems in funding models. There's insufficient operations and maintenance funding. Only half of allocated funds actually reach the communities. And then there's annual contribution agreements. These prevent long-term planning, delay implementation, and force communities to redirect funds from education, health, or child welfare. And then they talk about the high capital needs, upgrading all systems to acceptable standards would cost about $1 billion. And then the social determinants of water quality. Because of colonial processes, many reserves have poor land and water resources, low educational attainment. So this community is lowly educated, they still have poor land and water resources and limited economic opportunities, weakened governance and social cohesion, and eroded traditional knowledge. These factors make communities more vulnerable than similarly sized non-Indigenous groups. Okay, so basically you can see the bigger picture. I'm just scrolling past because we have a lot to go through, and I want you guys to be able to have enough time, or for me to have enough time for me to share all of this stuff. So one of the things that's important about this article is that they talk about, for example, the First Nations water management strategy. These are the policy debates around this. The plans of action for the drinking water that was made. Then there's a bill that was made in 2011, and then it was heavily criticized for infringing Indigenous rights. And then in 2012, they tried to change it, but still it proved inadequate. And then it also mentions the expert panels that recommended new federal legislation combined with Indigenous oversight, such as an Aboriginal Water Commission. And now this article does a very interesting comparison between Canada situation and the US. There's a tribe in the US, I think it's the Indians, yeah. So it says here 12% of American Indian, Alaskan Native households lack safe waters versus 0.6% of non-native households. There are common barriers. So between the First Nations and the Indian Alaska Natives is underinvestment, inappropriate infrastructure, poor local management capacity. So back to the article now. The author has policy recommendations, and these are building community capacity. So this is answering the activity currently. long-term stable funding, co-governance, and an Indigenous water authority, real consultation and Indigenous-led decision-making, and adaptive sustainability, which is integrating both Indigenous and Western systems. So what I just mentioned is very good for your final answer. What I've realized, another revelation that I realized is actually you can literally ask an intelligence or intelligence online intelligence apps to actually help you to find the themes if you don't have enough time, like what you're doing now. So I asked it what themes are coming up, because that's how you write in an essay. You know, you try to break it up into specific themes, and so, or the main themes. And here in this article, it talks about colonial legacy and structural inequality, and then talks about community capacity. That the communities lack trained operators, financial resources, adequate infrastructure. And the strange part is these communities usually have all this indigenous knowledge about how to actually look after water. But then the government now makes decisions that they're going to bring their own people who are supposedly educated, but they actually lack the understanding, the indigenous knowledge understanding of this community. But anyways, the community still lacks, trained operators, I think formally actually, because they are generational. I believe in generational knowledge anyways in these type of things. And then talks about the fragmented governance, that's one of the themes, and regulatory gaps. Sorry, I have to admit. Okay. So, sorry guys, I just lost my train of thought. So back to now, one of the themes is the funding, which was there's chronic underfunding and misallocation, and then the water quality, the social determinants, as well as the theme that people were historically displaced, poverty, marginal land distribution, trauma, and weakened community cohesion all directly affect the ability to maintain water systems. And then one of the other themes was a need for sustainable development and adaptive resilience. So there's the strong theme here. A strong theme is the need to build adaptive sustainability, a model where communities control their water systems and their futures, integrating tradition and modernity. And now we're going to skip what the author argues. So that was just basically giving you, I just want to see here. Sorry guys, just give me a second. I had quite a lot of information because for me, I like to reread until it sinks. So I didn't have time to cut it out. Okay, so now the next article is about liquid violence. This one, what's the author's name? I'll tell you at the end what the author's name is. So this author, basically the summary about this whole article is that it introduced, this is in South Africa, so it introduces the concept of liquid violence to explain the structural and racialized water inequality in post-apartheid South Africa. It focuses on the Waterberg region in Limpopo province, where Black, rural, poor, particularly ex-farm workers and their families face precarious access to water after being displaced from farms to the town of Valwater. In contrast, white landowners maintain control over water resources for their domestic and commercial needs. Then the author argues that this inequality in water access is a form of structural violence that has been normalized and legitimized through biopolitical processes. I will explain the whole biopolitical process in another summary, which is going to be so helpful. They explore how neoliberal policies have shifted water governance to emphasize individual responsibilization, where citizens are expected to pay for water services or provide labor to access water. So here, the key here is where citizens are expected to pay for water services. It's a very big thing in this learning unit. This approach reinforces existing inequalities, as the Black working poor are often unable to afford water or are forced to rely on communal taps, with limited supply. This article also examines the historical and political context of water access in South Africa, highlighting the enduring legacy of apartheid and colonialism in shaping water rights and property ownership. It critiques the state's role in perpetuating these inequalities by supporting private control over water resources and failing to intervene effectively to ensure equitable access. Equitable is another big highlight here. Ultimately, the article argues that the concept of liquid violence helps to understand how structural violence operates in water politics, linking visible inequalities to less visible dynamics of dispossession and marginalization. It calls for greater recognition and resistance to the naturalization of water inequality and biopolitical violence. Okay, so now the themes in this specific article, and there's the name of the article, The Politics of Water Responsibilization and Dispossession in South Africa. So the themes here is, okay, the liquid violence and the biopolitical violence. So let me now explain let's quickly read the liquid violence. So it's a concept of structural and racialized water inequality in South Africa, where water access disparities are normalized and perceived as ordinary rather than as a form of violence. And then I asked Adobe to explain to us what biopolitical violence is, so that your brain would connect that word quickly and wouldn't get confused if you had to be asked to list biopolitical whatevers. So biopolitical refers to the ways in which governments, institutions, or systems exercise power over life itself. That is, over people's bodies, health, well-being, and survival. It focuses on how political decisions, who gets to live, who suffers, and who lives are valued or ignored. It looks at how states or institutions manage populations through controlling essentials such as water, food, health, sanitation, land, movement, bodies. So biopolitical decision-making determines who receives the resources, who is protected, who is neglected, and who lives are made more vulnerable. So this one, if I had to give you like an example, which will probably be mentioned later in an article, possibly this one, is if you look at in South Africa currently, there are some villages do not have access to water completely, and the decision for those water supplies to be turned off in that specific part of South Africa is actually coming from the government itself. So it's basically choosing who's going to live and who to die, basically, through their structures. Okay, so let's skip to the next section. So, the other themes for this article, liquid violence, was neoliberalism and individual responsibilization. This is the shift in water governance under neoliberal policies, where access to water is tied to individual responsibility to pay for services. So that's it. Individual responsibilization is connected to money. It's connected to paying, which affects the poor. Structural inequality in water access, the unequal distribution of water resources between white landowners and black rural poor, highlights the intersection of race, class, and geography in water politics. And then its historical and political context. That's the legacy of apartheid and colonialism in shaping water access and property rights, with white landowners maintaining control over water resources despite post-apartheid legal reforms. Then there's the social reproduction and gender impact, the effects of water commodification on social reproduction, including increased health risks, the burden placed on women to secure alternative water sources. There we go. There's another gendered impact. The woman must spend 6 hours a day looking for water, and the child as well. Public versus private boundaries, the blurring and hardening of boundaries between public and private spheres in water politics, where public services are treated as market exchanges and private control over resource is legitimized. And then there's the resistance and inaction, the lack of state intervention to address water inequality, and resistance to these violent realities which have become naturalized in South African society. Okay, so those were the themes, just basically what the article is going through. I just want to see if this is Okay, so the critiques are structuralized and racialized water inequalities. The neoliberal policies are criticized in the article. The state inaction and complicity in the article is also criticized, and the normalization of inequality. The author critiques the naturalization of water inequality where disparities are perceived as ordinary or the fault of disadvantaged groups rather than as a result of structural violence and systemic justice. And then obviously the biopolitical violence, he argues that, and he argues the failure to address historical injustices. It's where he critiques the post-apartheid government's inability to dismantle the entrenched inequalities in water access, which continue to favor white landowners and perpetuate the marginalization of Black communities. Okay, fine. So we're done with this article now. So for example, the 4 suggestions for managing water more equitably, which is part of the assignment, but now in terms of this specific article is the redistribution of water resources, to manage water more equitably. They must implement policies to ensure equitable access to water by redistributing water resources from private landowners to marginalized communities. This could involve revisiting existing property rights and water allocation laws to prioritize domestic and basic needs over commercial use. The other suggestion for managing the water more equitably could be to invest in public water infrastructure. This is increasing state investment in water infrastructure to ensure a reliable and continuous access to safe water for all citizens, especially in impoverished rural and township areas. This includes upgrading communal water points and ensuring sufficient supply to meet the needs of a growing population. This is quite a bittersweet recommendation for me, because in other articles it actually tells you that Africa has so many wells, but there's poor maintenance. They don't get maintained, they become faulty, but you're gonna hear about that later in one of the articles. And then, so the other recommendation would be to address the structural inequalities, which is develop policies that actively address the historical and racialized inequalities in water access, including measures to support the Black working poor and ex-farm workers who have been displaced. Okay, this is just generic. You guys need to now put it in a way where it's actually making sense in today's time, because I feel like this is speaking like in the past. No, I can't put into words what I'm trying to say, but what I'm trying to say is you need to reword this addressing structural inequalities in such a way that it's like 2025 adequate. And then the other one is shift away from liberal water governance, move away from neoliberal model of individual responsibilization. So instead adopt a rights-based approach of water governance that treats water as a public good and ensures access for all. That's a very important one, that it should be treated as a public good that ensures access for all, regardless of income or ability to pay. And then, so in listing 4 benefits on how water should be managed, so establish clear, enforceable, and inclusive regulatory frameworks, ensure stable, long-term, this is the final answer of this specific session, ensure stable, long-term, and adequate funding, build indigenous community capacity, which is training and certification of water operators, local management expertise, community governance structures, infrastructure maintenance skills, empower the community with these skills, the infrastructure maintenance. Increase indigenous governance and decision-making power, give them a voice, more voice, in terms of indigenous-led water authorities, co-governance mechanisms, local control of system design, operation, and regulation. And then implement source water protection plans. That's another recommendation. Water must be protected from the source to the tap. This means stronger policies addressing land use, pollution control, and environmental protection in watersheds. And then adopt collaborative, community-driven planning and co-management models. Water management must be done within the communities, not imposed on them. The article repeatedly shows that First Nations feels excluded from decisions and lack control over local water systems. So basically just involve the community more, like allow them to manage the models. And then, oh, what's this? Okay, so it says that I must integrate traditional knowledge with modern water management, which is, the author argued that sustainable solutions must combine indigenous knowledge systems, which is what I was talking about, that actually the people who were there way back before the government authorities, they knew how to manage their waters. And so now the author is arguing, saying that they must combine indigenous knowledge systems, Western science, and local environmental understanding. This contributes to adaptive sustainability, which is essential for long-term water security. Okay, moving on to the next section, water scarcity narratives. Growing concerns over water are linked to a crisis which is generally perceived as the lack of enough available water. That's potable water, water for agricultural and industrial use, and maintaining functioning ecosystems. This crisis is central to current debates and policy making. Thus, the diverse literature on water uses and management has fostered discourse around the causes of the water crisis. Some scholars argue that the crisis arose as a result of the mismanagement of water resources, while others argue that the recent levels of increased scarcity of water can be attributed to climate variability and hydrological alterations. And then it shares a very interesting view that the study guide, they say that water, defining it, is complex, and according to Reichs-Berman, dependent on how human and environmental water needs are defined, the amount of water that can be made available for these needs, as well as the temporal and spatial scales used to define scarcity. It thus follows that for different contexts, water scarcity has a different meaning. The indefinite way in which water scarcity can be defined, however, gives room for different accounts to be made, and these may not necessarily have anything to do with water being physically scarce, but institutional and political. So you see another aspect now onto the debate that, this is another thing we're going to look at very critically in this module. The different competing needs for water and competing water users mean that the demand for the resource creates winners and losers. The result is, as Nogieza points out, that scarcity is not experienced by all, but is manufactured through political processes and institutions that disadvantage the poor. Water scarcity narratives are therefore framed around the view of water being an economic good, the need for infrastructure to distribute water from source to point, efficiency in its use, as well as for ecological purposes, water for nature. Central to debates on the water crisis are the measurements employed. For example, a water crisis can be measured either on a national or a local scale, using different contexts, indicators, and approaches. A practical example can be drawn from the South African case study and those of Central West Asia. In the South African context, the water crisis is measured at the national scale, with causes ranging from climate variations like the El Nino effect, so the El Nino effect is a measuring scale, and acid mine drainage, which has resulted for the mining industry, placing the country in a water and financial crisis. On the other hand, Central Asia and West Africa's water crises are generally attributed to the arid nature of those geographic regions. The question of how water crises impact poor populations is also at the center of current debates. Although the causes relating to water crises may vary across regions, the associated effects are generally adverse, especially among the poor populations. For these populations, water crises pose a threat beyond just an economic crisis. It is a life crisis. Their health, well-being, and livelihoods are disrupted by the lack of water, therefore perpetuating their poverty status. Strategies towards the management of the water crisis, that's another big theme for critical look, is the strategies towards management of the water crisis often perpetuates the poverty situation of these populations. This calls for an understanding of trade-offs. Water shedding is managing demand, and increasing tariffs is reducing non-revenue water. However, whilst these are technically sound management options, as you note, they can have trade-offs for encouraging poor people to accept these interventions. Although countries would argue that the impact of tariffs is to encourage water conservation, it does not impede access, as everyone is allowed a set amount of free water, for example, 6 kiloliters in South Africa. Okay, so the next activity had to do with defining the narratives of water scarcity, then writing down the main arguments from different sources and save the sources for use in your assignment. Okay, so basically there's an article that talks about the centrality of water resources. This article was speaking about, let's just go to the question again. Okay, so this is his narrative. He talks about achieving SDG and SDG 1. Okay, these are his exact words. Sorry, let me go to a section that's going to answer this thing better. I just want to look, there's something that I had. Okay, so these are some of the narratives, but these are so in the natural distribution, limited freshwater availability tells us that only 2% of global water is freshwater and just 0.5% is accessible for human use. Africa has the least percentage of freshwater resources compared to other continents. This is the narrative by the first guy. I don't know if you have your study guide next to you, but I forgot to actually stipulate who is writing this narrative, which author is writing this narrative, but I'll tell you at the end. Okay, so the other narrative talks about that natural distribution of water is geographically and seasonally variable, with some areas experiencing abundance while others face scarcity. It tells us about the climate change and variability. The climate change exacerbates water scarcity through erratic rainfall, prolonged droughts, and extreme weather events, particularly affecting the poorest and at least resilient companies. The other one talks about climate change, which impacts the hydrological cycle, reducing water security and increasing the risk of water-related diseases. The other narrative is the population growth and development challenges. So in this article, it tells us about Africa's unprecedented population growth and development needs, which increase the demand for water resources, which are already limited in some regions. Then the continent's reliance on rain-fed agriculture and water. That is a narrative, that's a general narrative for almost every article about the fact that Africa relies on rain-fed agriculture. And then degradation and pollution. They talk about degradation of water resources due to pollution, untreated wastewater discharge, and overuse has led to compromised water quality and reduced availability. And then they talk about unsustainable practices such as overfishing and indiscriminate fishing threaten aquatic ecosystems and water-dependent industries. I just want to give you like an example of what I saw on someone's status where they fish as a hobby. So they went into one of these little venues here in Joburg locally. They pulled out like 15 fish. They fished 15 fish. And then I'm asking myself, why in your good mind are you going to kill 15 fish from this little river when you only have a family of like 4? You know, what are you going to do with all those 15 big fish? But for him, it was like an ego thing. And that for me was just extreme overfishing. And then transboundary water conflicts. This is shared water resources such as the Nile and Lake Chad have been sources of contention among African nations, leading to conflicts over ownership, usage, and development. We know this transboundary goes back even into the Bible days when Lot and his uncle Abraham were fighting over water. And this is a big issue. Countries don't want to share water. Some countries try to share water diplomatically, and they have all these policies and agreements, like Sudan and Egypt. These conflicts highlight the need for mutual cooperation and effective management of transboundary water resources. Then they talk about economic and social impacts. Water scarcity affects agriculture, livestock production, energy generation, manufacturing, tourism, and trade, which are key economic drivers in Africa. So these are more narratives. Lack of access to clean water contributes to health issues, waterborne diseases, and reduced labor productivity. The other narrative is under the theme of sustainable development. So all these narratives are under different themes. As you can see, the one is economic, the other is sustainable, etc. Despite challenges, Africa has significant potential for sustainable water management, including rainwater harvesting, irrigation, recycling, and conservative of watersheds. And then it talks about collaborative management, informed policies, and investment in water infrastructure. Okay, so that was Mugaga, by the way. That was Mugaga. So we're not going to read the summary of the findings, but these are the different sectors that get affected. These are different sectors that actually get affected. There's another narrative. Agriculture gets affected, livestock production, energy, manufacturing and processing, tourism, gets affected, health gets affected, payment for ecosystem services affects people, fisheries, Water resources are central to Africa's development across all sectors. However, challenges like degradation, underutilization, and conflicts must be addressed through investment, sustainable policies, and regional cooperation to achieve SDGs. Okay, we're not reading the author's summary in words. I'm sorry, guys, I had a lot of notes for this section because I had to really dig deep into... Okay, so now we're moving into the next article. The NAIC article, which was the water crisis in Africa, a myth or a reality. So this was quite an interesting article to read. But the main themes in this article are, there's a political theme, which is related to governance issues. And then it tells us that bad governance is the primary reason Africa's water infrastructure has been ineffective. Corruption, corrupt governments have often committed serious human rights violations. And then foreign aid dependency, large foreign aid has trapped many African nations in a cycle of corruption. This is all in the NAIC article. And then the economic water scarcity. Economic scarcity has to do by people buying water, you know. And so here it's telling us economic scarcity is caused mainly by people's lack of monetary means to utilize adequate sources of water. Then another one is agriculture and food security. Agriculture accounts for more than 80% of water consumption. Then the foreign investment and trade theme here, it tells us Africa's commodities have attracted huge foreign investments, particularly from Brazil, Russia, India, and China. Then there's the economic potential. Africa has 25% of the world's arable land and is capable of feeding the world by focusing primarily on agriculture. So this article still says that Africa has actually, you know, got a good chance to grow economically. Environmental themes, it's global climate change. Global warming will be more intense in Africa than in the rest of the world. The physical water scarcity, Africa being mostly arid or hyper-arid is highly vulnerable to global climate patterns such as El Nino, southern oscillation. The natural resource abundance, Africa does have abundant water resources, including large rivers and vast reservoirs. So you're hearing, like, some people say Africa has abundance, some people are like Africa has this. So that's the whole point now. These are debates. You need to make notes of these things, that, you know, that some people are saying this and some people are disagreeing. based off just looking here. The other one is environmental conservation. Conserving wetlands and rivers must therefore be a priority for the African governments targeting water security and poverty reduction. The other relevant themes for this NAIC article are social and human development. It talks about the population growth. It talks about infrastructure challenges. And this article, Myths versus Reality, this article challenges common myths about Africa's water crisis, such as the belief that Africa suffers from physical water scarcity and that large international aid can eradicate water scarcity. So let's now talk about the actual article. Let's summarize the article up. So this article by NAIC explores the multifaceted issue of water scarcity in Africa, analyzing whether it is a myth or a reality. It highlights the critical role water plays in human development, including health, agriculture, education, economics, and peace. While Africa is often perceived as a continent plagued by perpetual water scarcity, this article challenges this notion, arguing that the crisis is largely economic rather than physical. It examines the causes, impact, and myths surrounding Africa's water crisis and proposes remedial measures to address the issue. So the reality, here it discusses the reality. It tells us that Africa faces significant water-related challenges, particularly economic water scarcity. It explains key concepts such as water stress, water deficit, and water scarcity, emphasizing that water scarcity becomes a crisis when it leads to dangerous situations affecting communities or societies. Then they use the Falcon Mark water stress indicators to measure the water vulnerability. So there's another thing that you can state in this article. It uses the Falcon Mark. This article notes that while only 8 African countries faced water stress or scarcity in 1990, the situation has worsened, with projections indicating that by 2030, up to 250 million people in Africa will live in areas of high water stress. And then this article tries to tell us the reasons for the water crisis, which is, it tells us that 2 primary causes of water scarcity in Africa are physical scarcity and economic scarcity. Physical scarcity is that Africa is the second driest continent, with arid and hyper-arid regions vulnerable to global climate patterns like El Nino and climate change. Rising temperatures and changing rainfall patterns exacerbate water stress. And then it tells us about the overexploitation of water resources has led to the shrinking of major lakes such as Lake Chad, which has lost 90% of its volume. Then the economic scarcity is the widespread poverty and weak infrastructure limit access to clean water. Sub-Saharan Africa is particularly affected, with many living on less than $1 a day. And then it tells us about poor governance and corruption hinder effective water management and infrastructure maintenance. And then this article tells us what water scarcity does, how it impacts on development. It impacts on the health of the nation. Children are dying in some countries. You're reading stories about the water so bad that the kids are there's that disease that takes you to hospital if you drink dirty water. So most of that nation just keeps on going to hospital for the same thing. Agriculture, education, there you go. It literally speaks about the food security is affected. Education-wise, women and children spend more time looking for water. Economic productivity, people are losing 40 billion potential work hours annually due to water collection efforts. And then the conflict is water scarcity can exacerbate tribal and military conflicts, further destabilizing the region. So the myth part of this article is it challenges the perception that Africa actually suffers from physical water scarcity, from physical water scarcity. So it argues that the continent has abundant water resources, including large rivers, which is in the Congo, now Zambezi, and vast groundwater reserves. However, the uneven distribution, #inequality, in distribution of water resources and population density creates localized shortages. For example, the Congo Basin holds 30% of Africa's water, but is home to only 10% of its population. And then the article debunks several myths about Africa water crisis. It debunks that Africa lacks access to water. It tells us that this issue is not the absence of water, but the lack of clean, adequate, and conveniently provided water. It talks about the physical water scarcity, that most African countries have sufficient water resources, but poor management and uneven distribution creates shortages. It talks about agriculture. While agriculture is vital, Africa has other options for economic growth, such as mineral resources and trade. It talks about large-scale engineering projects are the solution. Then it mentions small-scale, locally managed solutions are often more effective than large dams, which can disrupt ecosystems and displace communities. It talks about international, the other myth is that international aid will, these are the myths. Africa lacks access to water, physical water scarcity, agriculture is the key to solving hunger and poverty, large-scale engineering projects are the solution, international aid will solve the crisis. Fine. Now, explaining the last point, excessive foreign aid has fostered dependency and corruption, hindering Africa's self-reliance and innovation. Okay, so basically that's what the article debates. Let's see the end. Let's see what the article concludes. So the article concludes that Africa's water crisis is a complex issue influenced by political, economic, and environmental factors. While the continent faces significant challenges, it also has immense potential due to its abundant natural resources, arable land, and opportunities for economic growth. The author calls for a cultural shift and better governance to unlock Africa's potential and address its water and development challenges by focusing on local solutions, knowledge transfer, and sustainable practices. Africa can overcome its water crisis and achieve long-term development. Okay, there we go. That's how he ends off. He ends off very optimistically. Okay, now we skip. The reason why I have these notes is because when I'm trying to find the argument, I'm able to find it quickly just by looking at the inverted commas, you know, and then I'm able to add meat to back up whatever I want to say. And then Julia's article this one is talking about the water resource management, which is quite big because this is like a policy of some sort, or let's read what this talks about. Water commodification refers to the process of treating water as an economic good or marketable product rather than as a basic human right or a public good. It involves assigning monetary value to water and managing its distribution and access through market mechanisms such as pricing, privatization, and commercial transactions. Key features of water commodification include market-based pricing, which is water that is priced based on supply and demand or its economic value, often leading to higher costs for consumers. Second key feature is privatization. Water services are managed by private entities, prioritizing profit over equitable access. The other one is cost recovery. This is when users are required to pay the full cost of water services, including infrastructure development, operation, and maintenance. The other one is exclusion of low-income groups, which is those that are unable to afford water tariffs or payments are often excluded from access to water resources, water services, leading to inequalities. Okay, so that's what this article is basically now sharing more about again, there's a political theme in this article. It talks about decentralization and governance. It includes challenges such as lack of capacity and fiscal support. It discusses it in relation to Ghana's local government and Malawi's decentralization. It talks about institutional competition among water management institutions, which leads to inefficiencies. I think you might want to screenshot here because then it tells you where these sections are, these themes in your article. I'll just leave this like this. You might want to screenshot here because it tells you roughly where it talks about class-based discrimination and sanitation policies based on geography and social class, roles of donors, the environmental themes. It tells us the pollution and ecosystem degradation. All of this stuff is where you can get this information. The social themes. I can't read everything because of time, but I'm giving you enough time to be able to screenshot for this article. So I'm just giving you enough time here. There we go. Okay. Okay. Because this dissertation, ladies and gentlemen, or this thesis is 400 pages. It's ridiculous. So it's just, you know, all you need to do is just state a theme and then just write in brackets, you know, that author's name, back it up. Okay, so now what, okay. According to the author, the role of IWRM in the paper is critiqued for its implementation challenges and negative impacts, particularly in Africa. The author highlights the following points in this article: that the implementation of IWRM has remained a challenge, with developing countries like South Africa, Ghana, and Malawi using the Dublin principles to drive reforms in water supply and sanitation sectors. And then it tells us that the IWRM has failed to address competition amongst various users, leading to duplication of efforts and inconsistent pricing by different water institutions. It tells us that there's a participatory matrix of IWRM requires resources at the local level, which are often lacking. It tells us that IWRM has not advanced the interests of marginalized groups, such as women and children. So this whole management system is being critiqued in this article, and you know that it's cost recovery philosophies undermining water as a social and public good. And then it talks about the implementation of it has caused more damage than the positive result. It also talks about the institutional arrangements have actually worsened the water and sanitation scarcity in Africa. It talks about how it failed to consider the local dynamics, you know, especially within Ghana and Malawi. And then it also mentions that there efficiency plans in Ghana and Malawi require reform to align with decentralized national ministries and fragile local authorities. And then it also tells us that the IWRM has exacerbated water and sanitation scarcity in Africa, particularly for rural and peri-urban households. And then it shares the focus on decentralization. You know, cost recovery and privatization has led to inequalities, institutional inefficiencies, and environmental degradation. It was also critiqued as a neoliberal framework that commodifies water, imposes excessive cost recovery, and decentralizes responsibilities without adequate resource, resulting in manufacturing water scarcity and perpetuating inequality. And the author calls for extensive reforms and a shift from manufactured scarcity to genuine abundance, prioritizing equity, sustainability, and water as a human right. And I think we're done. Yeah, we're done with this one. So you now know that what you need to refer if you're writing the political dimensions, environmental dimensions, social dimensions, economic dimensions. Every article has all these political, social, economic, environmental. They all have them. So when you write your article, you can just literally just, you know, structure it around that, or you could be more creative in your, I don't think, well, sorry, I need to admit. Okay. Where are we? Sorry. Okay, so so within these articles as well, there's case studies which are based on Ghana and Malawi, especially with this author. So you might want to quickly look at the case study. And South Africa is also mentioned in this case study. And then I think that's enough information for that article. Let's move on to the next one. Could we still have to go to the assignment? Okay, this is water governance. Let me just see. Sorry, I've skipped something. I just want to find. Oh, yes. So now we're doing water governance, the article about water governance, right? So water governance, the article about water governance, it reads an historical perspective on current debates, water development. So this Woodhouse article details historical perspectives on water governance, tracing its evolution from ancient times to modern debates. Now, these are the key points regarding this historical perspective. So, in the early societies, water governance has been integral to human societies since the advent of agriculture and settlement. Early efforts to manage water focused on enabling social cooperation, even through enforced collective action. Then it mentions that Carl Wittfogel theorized that hierarchical state formation was essential for developing irrigation infrastructure in hydraulic societies such as Mesopotamia, Egypt, and China, while his interpretation emphasized despotic governance. Okay, and then it's on the theme of. Okay, so some key points regarding the historical. It talks about the industrialization and nation building, that water management played a key role in industrialization, driving machinery, generating electricity, and enabling bulk transport. It gives examples. Shift. Luckily, when we write an essay, we can literally give our own examples from our own little context using South Africa. We don't have to use the article's examples. Shift in developed countries. In the postmodern world of developed countries, the focus shifted from increasing water supply through infrastructure to demand management and environmental protection. So some of the key features is global water governance initiatives. The historical perspective also examines key global events that shaped water governance. It talks about the 1977 conference, where it focused on the need for coordinated governance and declared access to drinking water a human right. It emphasized integration, environmental impact assessments, and multi-purpose water resource management. Then in 1992, the Dublin Principles, which are now being used now, which is they introduced the integrated water resource management framework. I know I probably made a mistake earlier and called it a policy. It emphasizes water as an economic good, participatory governance, and management at the river basin scale. This marked a shift toward normative, universal approaches to water governance. So all these three countries that we mentioned, Ghana, Malawi, and South Africa, they currently are invested in this integrated water resource management framework, as was written by the previous article, which was, I think it was Nonjingezi. You might have to just find it. And then the World Water Forums promoted the Dublin Principles, but faced criticism for prioritizing market-based approaches and corporate interests over local needs and environmental concern. Now, the modern debates and challenges about this article, the Muller article, is that the article highlights how historical narratives such as scarcity narrative have shaped modern water governance. Scarcity has been used to justify market-based approaches and environmental conservation, often sidelining social and developmental priorities. It also discusses the limitations of universal frameworks like IWRM, arguing that historical experiences show the need for context-specific governance approaches. So this article, with the previous article that I wrote, or who's it? Nonjingezi, they criticized this IWRM framework. And show its limitations. So in this governance article concerning the historical perspective, it tells us that the historical perspective underscored the dynamic and evolving nature of water governance shaped by changing society priorities, political economies, and environmental challenges. Okay, so let me tell you what debates this article touches on. I broke them down into themes once again. So political, the debate on this water governance article is the transboundary water governance. Remember, the challenges in managing shared rivers, the disputes between the countries. The other one was federalism and decentralization. This is tensions between national and subnational governance levels in countries like India, USA, and Australia. And then hydrohegemony. This is power dynamics in shared water resources, such as Turkey's control over the Tigris and Euphrates. And then the global water governance, limited success of global initiatives like the UN Water Courses Convention and calls for global governance frameworks. That's the political aspect of it. The social, sorry, I just want to make this more coherent. The social aspect debate, the social debate of this water governance article by Muller is participation and deliberative democracy. So the role of the stakeholder engagement in decision making and its challenges include power imbalances and high transaction costs. Then the equity in water allocation. There's an issue of fairness in water distribution among agriculture, urban users, and the environment. And then there's the community displacement, the social impact of water infrastructure projects such as dams on local populations. And then the environment, the debate on environment in this article, it talks about the trade-offs between ecological conservation and the need for infrastructure development in growing economies. And then there's the scarcity narrative, again, where the focus on water scarcity as a driver for governance, often prioritizing environmental conservation over social and economic goals. Then there's the river basin versus problem shared. There's a debate over the appropriate scale for water governance, questioning the dominance of river basin focused approaches. Then another debate here aspect economically is the market-based approaches, advocacy for treating water as an economic good, promoting pricing and market mechanisms, and the challenges of implementing these approaches. And then they give us an example. The economic water scarcity, the role of financial capacity in addressing water shortages, particularly in developing countries. And then there's the cost-benefit analysis, which is the usage of economic tools to balance environment and economic priorities as seen in the European Union's water framework. And then generally, they talk about, okay, the governance debate. So the types of governance that they do mention here is, like we said, they criticize the universal governance model, which is the integrated water resource management, and they call for adaptive, context-specific solutions. And then the other one is the polycentric governance. There's an emphasis on networks and nested hierarchies to address the complexity and diversity of water governance challenges. So these debates highlight the multifaceted nature of water governance, encompassing political, social, environmental and economic dimensions. And then that's it. I think in this article, okay, let's conceptualize the water governance. In this article, the article explores the theoretical underpinnings of water governance, focusing on three questions: participation and decision making. This is who should be involved in water governance decisions and how can their perspectives improve outcomes. And then scales, should governance institutions operate? Should governance focus on river basins or broader problem shades? The other one is the role of market mechanisms. Should water allocation be guided by market-based criteria or non-market approaches? So here it tells us that the author highlights the historical evolution of water governance from early collective action in agrarian societies to the role of water infrastructure in nation-building industrialization. They discuss the shift in developed countries towards demand management and environmental protection, contrasting this with the challenges faced by developing countries in managing growing water demands. Okay, so we've mentioned all the themes, these we've mentioned. Okay, so in this article, the case studies here, there's the European Union, which speaks about the Water Framework Directive. It promotes participatory governance, river basin management, and economic instruments, but its implementation has been slow and uneven. Then it talks about the USA, the federal system, and the diverse hydrologic regimes have led to patchwork of legal frameworks with limited coordination. India, water governance is characterized by federal-state tensions, groundwater overuse, and challenges in managing transboundary rivers. Participation is often undermined. They talk about Australia, South Africa. South Africa has a centralized governance, has maintained water security, but informal stakeholder involvement has been crucial in resource management. They talk about China, talk about Chile, Mexico, and Brazil. And to conclude this article concludes that water governance is inherently complex and context-specific. It is influenced by political factors, social, economic, physical. Universal approaches like IWRM and global water conventions have had limited impact, and there is growing recognition of the need for adaptive, locally tailored solutions. And the authors argue for broad principles of governance, such as fostering constructive state-society relations and designing systems to address specific challenges rather than imposing normative frameworks. So the article emphasizes the importance of balancing environment, social, and economic priorities in water governance, and highlights the role of networks and nested hierarchies in managing common pool resources like water, while debates about participation, scale, markets, and equity will continue. The authors advocate for pragmatic approaches that prioritize local needs and context-specific solutions over technical norms. In summary, the article provides a thorough exploration of the historical contemporary debates. Okay, done. Now, okay, now we've done this. Okay, sorry about this, guys. I'm trying to gather new information where I can, because, okay, we've spoken about the polycentric. It has been mentioned earlier. To those who joined late, we've basically started off beautifully with explaining the SDGs, and then we basically broke down the assignments, and most of these things that I'm scrolling past have been read. So I haven't done 2 articles from 5.3, but let's move on to the next section, because now we have 15 minutes. And water security, ecological integrity, and food production. As you noted in the previous sections, more polycentric approaches are now being promoted, which do not place water at the center, but on equal footing with other resources. In other words, ecological integrity is key to generating runoff and other environmental flows needed to sustain ground and surface water resources. It is equally true to say that communities thus need to be water secure for their lives to be sustained. Then the quality of water in many developing and developed countries raises concerns over water security and future sustainability of the resource, and that of ecosystems and livelihoods dependent upon water quality. Then it tells us that pollution has been a major driver of water insecurity, as polluted water is less accessible. And then it talks about explaining a South African case. The author points out that influences from South Africa's historical mining culture, the historical lack of environmental protection legislation, as well as laws that govern the locations of certain human settlements, have set in motion the fragmentation of land, loss of riparian zones for many aquatic systems, and the direct degradation of those systems. Once water resources have been polluted, it is difficult and in most cases impossible to return them to a pristine state. Okay, so here, this activity 5.3, we will not do it. All I'm doing is I'm just explaining the term linkages and how you can now figure it out, but it's not difficult, because here, let's give examples. It says linkages refer to the connections, relationships, or interdependencies, sorry about this, between different systems, sectors, ideas, or processes. They show how one element affects or influences another. Now, why do linkages matter? In SD, Sustainable Development, nothing exists in isolation. Environmental, social, political, and economic systems interact. Understanding linkages helps us to see how a change in one area can create effects, either positive or negative in another. So, example of linkages in our notes are climate change and food security. Climate change affects rainfall, temperature, and water availability, which directly affects food production, prices, and nutrition. So there is a linkage between climate systems and food systems. The second one is there's a linkage between water security, agriculture, and ecosystem health. Water scarcity impacts irrigation. Agriculture influences soil quality, and ecosystems determine water purification. There's the nexus, that's a linkage. So maybe whoever's bold, instead of focusing on this chapter, you can just focus on nexus, the nexus question, the other assignment, you know, which is there's a linkage between energy and water and food. Producing energy needs water, agriculture needs water and energy production affects water availability. This is why the water energy food nexus is based entirely on linkages. Then another linkage is social inequality and access to resources. Historical inequalities shape who gets access to water, land, and economic opportunities. Okay, so I've given you information about generally what linkages are, which is actually also, because we didn't touch on linkages, the nexus, I think we did, but not so well. I think that was quite good. And then the last section, which is climate change impacts on water. Can you guys read this yourself? And then let me just go to the activity because of time, right? Please just read the beginning yourselves. I'm just taking you guys to the activity in respecting your time. So the activity says design a concept map in which you identify a water challenge. Its various impacts and which sectors are affected by the impacts and how. So, okay, so let me just see here. Okay, let's go to the concept map straight. Okay, so here, this question is basically asking us to speak about the water challenge, and then how it impacts, how the water challenge impacts I guess the people, and then it moves to the sectors. So what is the water challenge? The water challenge is the droughts, floods, etc. And then the impacts would be reduced river flows, dry wells, infrastructure damage from the floods, contamination in the water, so water challenges, sectoral impacts. Okay, so you've got agriculture, the sector of agriculture, the sector of energy, the sector of water supply, and the sector of industry and manufacturing. And then let me quickly just, yeah, so you see here, you might just want to screenshot this. These are the sectors to answer this question here, sorry. I'm giving you 1 second to screenshot. Okay, and then here, these are other sectors. All the ones in red are the ones that have come out of the article. That's why I've highlighted them in red. You can ignore, and the ecosystems, you can use it. There we go, you can screenshot that. Okay, so here, like, if you remember the article in the beginning told us to read Uruma and Ozor, Wabwere and Mwasha and Robinson. So, okay, we've already talked about, okay, so in still talking about who gets impacted when there's water challenges, right? It's the poor and the food insecure, women and children, rural rain farmers, low-lying delta cities, communities reliant on water. See, I didn't think that, I think 1 hour was too short, but it's okay, 1 hour, 30 minutes. Okay, fine. So let me give you how I did it. So I took each article. This is the strategy I used to answer this question, this activity. So first of all, I try to understand what do they mean by water challenges and Obviously, it's telling us that it's an issue that disrupts the ability of people, communities, or environment to obtain clean, safe, and sufficient water for drinking, sanitation, agriculture, industry, and ecosystem health. And the water challenges here are either physical, which is like your drought. We did mention that. Economic, which is the lack of infrastructure, poor management, inadequate investment, poverty because people can't access it. It's expensive. Poor water quality from mining activities and agricultural, ineffective water governance. The responsibilities are unclear by the governance, multiple institutions overlap, then the inadequate infrastructure. So all my articles, I basically broke them down about what are the various impacts spoken about in this article. I just want to see something else. So that's the structure I use. I broke it down. But every article basically speaks about everything we've spoken about. There's nothing new. Nothing new under the sun. No author is unique. Many types of energy. Okay, the energy sector. We mentioned the different sectors. Okay, let's see. What's this? Let me see this table. Okay, this table speaks about the... Okay, do you want to screenshot this? Again, this one is an easier table. The impacts. This is there. You can screenshot this. The impact of water challenges. There we go. In case you get asked this question, you can literally write a book just about this, just from looking at this table. So we can't discuss the articles here, but what I can do is look for very important information. That I'm so sorry to do this to you guys. Okay, let's see here. Okay, so the article about more the perception of rural households and climate change. Here it's a case study. So to make it easier for you guys, the summaries, you just needed to basically just study the findings. I think just study the findings, just read the findings of that article, because then at least it's telling you, you know, the different sectors that are affected or impacted, you know, and then you see it tells us about how the water resources are impacted. So in that article, just go straight to the findings, or yeah, that's the shortcut to that article. And then I just want to see other information that can help you. Okay, that's it. So in this unit, we had introduced you to some of the pertinent issues in water and sustainable development. Of course, it pointed out how water resources are increasingly in demand, while there are different opinions regarding whether water is really scarce. That is in that article about the myth and is it a myth or is it real? The facts and figures paint a picture that shows that if it is not managed well, the debates on whether the scarcity narratives are real or not will become null and void. Considering the effects of pollution and climate change on water resources, it becomes clear how urgent it is for all stakeholders to play their part in ensuring sustainability of the resources, as water has no substitute. Okay, guys, now I'm going to stop the recording because that's the end of class. I know that we had a lot to cover, but I tried to simplify it as best as I could. I tried to point out the main themes, the common themes, and now just using different information. And obviously you don't have to say political, you just talk. You talk about the political situation depending on how the question is answered. And if you look at the assignment question, I'm sure now it's not going to be as complicated as it seems, because we've covered everything in detail. We've even gone through most of the articles, except for, I think there's like 3 articles we didn't discuss, of which it's in section 5.3 if I'm not mistaken, but I'll update you guys. So do join me tonight for the for the LU6, so that we